You're live.
Okay, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome back. I've been away for a few weeks since December due to conferences and research and activities, but I'm back into a whole series on Palestine from a decolonial lens. And today, what I wanted to actually discuss is the recent meeting that took place with the PLO Executive Central Council meeting on the 15th of this past month. And the important part of it is the reference by the PLO Council on suspending or attempting to suspend the recognition of Israel, which basically is a reconsideration or rethinking of the Oslo framework. And I think it's important for us to recognize once and for all that the Oslo framework is dead, that it's been dead for quite some time and buried many times over. I would argue that Oslo was a complete failure from the first minute it was signed. And in this context, I want to reference an article that I wrote way back immediately after the signing of Oslo. This was written immediately in the month of October 1993, just a few weeks after Oslo was signed in September 1993. And the piece appeared in Decolonize magazine in their spring issue of 1994. And I said at the time, the title of the article, "The Price of the PLO Surrender, Almost a State." Specifically in here, what I wanted to frame the Oslo Agreement as the PLO surrender to the diktat of Israel and the United States, and not really achieving a state, not even almost a state. And I said the Oslo Agreement hence signals the end of the Palestine Liberation Organization if it is understood to be a goal or a plan to achieve freedom, dignity, liberation for the Palestinians. So Oslo Agreement did not do that. And in its place, I said, a South African-style homeland will be instituted that will be ruled by Yasser Arafat in terms of the PA and his hand-picked supporters at the time. More importantly, the Oslo Agreement ushers in a whole project of recolonizing the Middle East because it provided that the Oslo Agreement provided the bridge through which the normalization pattern intensified, normalization patterns with the Arab and Muslim world. So let me step back a little bit and speak about the Oslo Agreement framework. The Oslo Agreement did not bring an end to the occupation. In the letters, the exchange letters that was undertaken by Yasser Arafat at the time and Rabin, Yasser Arafat committed himself to recognition of Israel as a sovereign state, while attaching to this United Nations resolutions of 1967 in this framework relative to a two-state solution. And as such, it recognized Israel, but as we know, Israel does not have a defined borders. And then in the corresponding letter that Rabin actually exchanged, it only committed Israel to recognizing the PLO as the legitimate representative of the Palestinians to enter into what's called final status negotiations. So the major strategic weakness and error on behalf of the Palestinian leadership at the time, which we are facing its consequences today, that the exchange of recognition, on the one hand, the Palestinian representative in terms of the PLO, through the agency of Yasser Arafat and his power for the institution, recognized a sovereign state, and Israel in return only recognized the PLO as an organization, but not committing itself or recognizing or putting into words the fact that Israel is an occupying power. So what that facilitated essentially is the maintaining of the asymmetry relationship between the occupier and the occupied, and replaced the existing military framework that existed in the West Bank as well as in the Gaza Strip, even though Israel withdrew its troops from the Gaza Strip but redeployed and intensified settlement activities in the West Bank. In essence, it provided, from just a surface reading, prima facie reading of the Oslo Agreement, in essence gave legitimacy for all of Israel activities inside the occupied territories. In 1993, when Oslo was signed, there were approximately 140,000 settlers. Now we are tugging on close to 600,000 settlers that are in the West Bank. Not to mention the massive confiscation of land, not to forget the building of the apartheid wall, the separation of Palestinians inside the West Bank into different cantons, different areas that are crisscrossed on the one hand by the wall, by bypass roads, by security areas, and then on the macro level, the West Bank was divided into three areas: Area A, Area B, and Area C. So from the conceptualization of Oslo, it's actually facilitated the structural dismemberment of the contiguity of the Palestinian society in the occupied territories and in the West Bank, and on top of this allowed the Israeli settler colonial project to actually crisscross and dissect the Palestinians in a very sophisticated divide and conquer or divide and rule tactic. In addition, what Oslo have made possible is the transferring of the security infrastructure, and I think at one level Oslo is a security agreement that allowed for the shifting of the security from the Israeli military to the Palestinian various Palestinian security forces, especially in Area A, which has the high density of Palestinian population, while Area B and Area C, Palestinian had civilian responsibility but not military or security responsibility. So in this sense, Israel resorted back to classical colonial structure, where you have a colonial power that utilizes indigenous population or select aspect of the indigenous population in order to provide security against the indigenous population that continues to mount resistance to its occupation and its continued dispossession. Now, fast forward, also part of Oslo is also this economic project or economic program. Palestinians have been promised economic investment to try to create a peace based on economic cooperations or economic development. And again, this was a framework where I would call it that the Palestinians were promised to have almost a golden cage. This golden cage facilitated a particular aspect of Palestinian economy that is connected to the Israeli economy. But this has been the case from the first day that occupation and settlements and settler colonialism, it's always been vested in economic domination. So in essence, gave legitimacy to a settler colonial economic project, but in essence having Palestinian intermediaries to actually facilitate and make permanent that which is illegal under international law, and that which essentially has been set against the best interests of the Palestinians. In here, I would like to remind people that it's the same type of framework in terms of economic planning, economic development, same framework in Oslo that was used in South Africa during the apartheid period, especially as international pressure on apartheid South Africa intensified. There was a whole plan of that. Instead of ending economic support, cooperation, and normalization with apartheid South Africa, what we need is constructive engagement, is we need to invest in South Africa, and in particular invest with black South Africans, in essence to try to put a facade of progress, a facade of development, and in essence, in order for South Africa to go out to the world and say, you see, apartheid is not that bad, and look how much we're helping the black South Africans in South Africa, and therefore all of you who are critiquing and engaging in boycotts of South Africa are completely don't understand what is taking place, and long and behold you have South African apartheid sending out some representative of the black South Africans who are benefiting from the apartheid system because of being intermediary, going outside and speaking on the world stage, in essence, is saying that, you know what, apartheid is not that bad, we still are working on it, and in essence, you are going to hurt blacks if you engage in boycotts and if you engage in pressuring the South African government. And I think it's an exact language that we're using, that the Israeli apartheid system is using today relative to Palestine and the Palestinians. Recently we had these pamphlets that have been mailed throughout here in the West under the rubric of invest in peace. And you have these political personalities that are touting the investment to bring Palestinians and Israelis together. And I think what need to be clearly stated that economic development and progress under occupation is an oxymoron, and what we need is to invest in justice in order to achieve peace. So the promotion or utilizing civil society figures, especially in the Western world, the United States and other places, by framing it in such a public relations framing of invest in peace, which is malleable, it's huggable, it's actually cleans up, but in reality it's actually maintains the status quo, maintains occupation, maintains settlements, maintains control, maintains domination, and constantly actually obfuscate the basis of what is occurring. So the same deal that was given to South Africa during the later period of apartheid has been part and parcel of Oslo framework from the get-go, and continues to be the framing of promoting a golden cage for the Palestinians. And I think we need to be aware of this in a very clear way in order for us to identify what does it mean to ending the occupation, what does it mean for the Palestinians to be free, what does it mean for them to have dignity, what does it mean for them to actually achieve peace in their own land and sovereignty over their own land. The promotion of this constructive engagement, the promotion of a golden cage economic cage is very problematic. Adding to this dimension is what we're seeing right now, where the United States is attempting to essentially pressure the Palestinians economically by withholding aid, and aid to the Palestinians have always been contingent on their performance relative to Israeli diktat. And from day one, U.S. foreign aid, European foreign aid, and I would also mention Arab and Muslim world foreign aid, passes through Israeli hands, and as such it makes it possible for empowering and strengthening Israel's political position vis-a-vis the Palestinian. And what the United States right now in the Trump era is attempting to use the livelihood of Palestinians by, one, threatening the actual foreign aid that goes to Palestine from the annual allotment budgetary, but also in withholding or cutting the funding for UNRWA, as a way to try to force the Palestinians to accept the unacceptable, to accept a rotten deal that does not give the Palestinian the basic framework of anything resembling a independent sovereignty or control of their own destiny as such. So what the United States currently is basically running and pressuring the Palestinians to accept the most draconian type of framework for the Palestinians. So this Ramallah and in the Palestinian Authority is using double speak, because we don't have a meaning of what does suspension mean. If Israel already have abandoned Oslo, if Netanyahu already said that Oslo has failed, if the Israeli Knesset has already moved to actually annex not only Jerusalem but also on the road to annexing the West Bank, if there is a refusal from the political spectrum that is governing in Israel today of any notion of a two-state solution, so Israel has already have abandoned Oslo for the longest period of time. So suspension seems to be that it's a double speak on the Palestinian Authority's side, without giving us a clarity and understanding of what are the conditions that actually provide the Palestinians to continue to recognize a state that does not give them recognition or a standing on their own land. And I think here is the major contradiction where the Palestinian Authority, as well as I would say the PLO, is not actually taking responsibility for leading the Palestinian forward at the most critical juncture. Now, I understand that Oslo was a major mistake, no question about it. It was not negotiated by the Palestinians inside the occupied territories. It was done in haste. It had no strategic consideration whatsoever. It had no idea or no understanding of the framework of international law that was operable at the time and continued to be forth. We had no international expertise looking at the agreement. All that is correct and valid, and I think scholarly writing already have done considerable part of it. And I think Netanyahu's leadership and the Israeli political elites after the assassination of Rabin have set its course to actually prevent any possibility of a two-state solution. So the PLO and the Palestinian Authority is really at a fork in the road at this point. The continuation of the status quo, continuation of having a Palestinian Authority, continuation of military cooperation and security cooperation, which facilitate the structural oppression and the structural domination of the Palestinians by means of utilizing Palestinian hand, the economic cooperation that facilitate the normalization of the settler colonial projects inside Palestine, and then allows Israel to use the Palestinians as a bridge to penetrate Arab and Muslim markets, as well as to go around the globe to say that we have these economic relations with the Palestinians and we are on the road to peace, but it's actually a road to a piece of land, meaning that Israel has thought of peace, is acquiring more and more of the Palestinian peace. And then also the complete claims that have been forwarded on Jerusalem, which see the consequences of what this U.S. decision, but also it's been the standing Israeli policy that was forwarded and pushed on by AIPAC for the longest period of time, both at the U.S. Successive U.S. administration. So this is an Israeli decision on the annexation of Jerusalem, beginning immediately after 1967 and culminating with the move of the U.S. Embassy. We see the lack of any movement or progress on the refugees and the right of return. So from all the critical issues that were part of the Oslo framework, and this is not to even mention the water rights, the freedom of movement, freedom of travel, all these issues that were supposed to be negotiated within a 5-year period from Oslo have been completely set aside. And now what we have is Israel is not only the hegemon within Palestine, having total control, but it's the hegemonic power throughout the region. and the facilitation of relations across the Arab and Muslim world, where also the priorities toward facing or having a confrontation with Iran from the Arab world have made Israel the more strategic ally. And I think the PLO and the Palestinian Authority bears some responsibility of accepting to be that bridge that facilitated this process. So what do I project, and what is the steps that needs to be undertaken? And I think this is again a point that I want to emphasize and come back to it again and again. One, we have to understand that we're dealing with a settler colonial project in Israel that is also implementing various levels or various structures of apartheid. There's an apartheid in 48 relative to the Palestinians in 48, and also a different level of settler colonialism with various mechanisms of apartheid structure, creating a similar to the homelands that South Africa has created in South Africa during the heydays of apartheid. That's one. Second, we need to come into terms that Oslo created a Palestinian Authority with the responsibility of implementing occupation and facilitating Israel's occupation by means of Palestinian hands. This is not to critique or to say anything about the intentions of people that were engaged, but to understand that that's where we are at now, that the Israel security, Israel occupation, and Israel's expansion of settlement and infrastructure is being carried out with the consent and the facilitation of Palestinian security forces and Palestinian Authority. So that has to be understood. Third, the foreign aid and the support that is being sent to us from the United States or Europe or even Arab and Muslim countries, with few exceptions, are being facilitated as a way to actually strengthen Israel's hand at the expense of the Palestinians. Meaning there is no such thing as a free lunch, and the lunch that has been given to us in terms of foreign aid has been to put us on the menu, courtesy of Israel's demands and requirement. It is always framed of how to actually provide security for Israel by means of the foreign aid that is directed. This is a very difficult point because on the one hand, Palestinians are facing still one of the longest refugee crises in the modern history, with again beginning being refugees from not only 48. I would say Palestinians became refugees as soon as the Balfour Declaration and the British colonial occupation began, all the way up to the current period. So almost 100 years of Palestinian presence as refugees. So it's a very difficult period of how to negotiate, on the one hand, the needs of fulfilling the needs of the massive Palestinian population. On the one hand is refugees outside of Palestine. On the other hand, refugees inside the occupied territories. Third, an occupied population inside the occupied territories, and then population that is in 1948 that is facing direct apartheid, and then Palestinian Bedouins that completely have no standing whatsoever. So how to look and examine all these elements while simultaneously not allowing the foreign aid and foreign donations to actually dictate the agenda. So in essence, that the foreign aid from all these state actors and international bodies are actually almost are acting as the intensive care unit for the Israeli settler colonial project, and Palestinians in essence have been used as a bargaining chip in the process. So we need to come into terms with what are the consequences of what I call is the non-profit industrial complex that is acting on the Palestinians, or the humanitarian industrial complex, or the state actors that also are coming and engaging with a humanitarian project, and how for our own leadership collectively to arrive to understand those dynamics. So that's very important. Fourth, the economic development that is undertaken since the time of Oslo up to this present have entrenched settler colonialism and entrenched the Israeli occupation by means of economic cooperations and facilitating the creation of a Palestinian economic elite that is benefiting from these relations, and connected it to the broader Arab and Muslim world in economic relations. Now, the sixth point, which is very, very critical and important relative to Oslo, it facilitated, again, the breakdown of the Palestinian party politic, or even the possibility of unity in the Palestinian political spectrum. So what are the national priorities for the Palestinians? What are the national agenda? I said it at the time, 1993, and even much earlier than that the structure of Oslo and the structure of Israel's political machination was to destroy the Palestinian Liberation Organization as a framework that have encapsulated the Palestinian hopes, aspirations, and visions with contradictions, was to actually eliminate this body that at a certain point had far more recognition, had far more vitality, far more ability across the globe than Israel itself. And I think Oslo, as we are evidenced by what is taking place, not only that the PLO is a shadow of the shadow of the shadow of its distant past, it's almost non-existent as a full functioning body. The Palestine National Council is completely destroyed. The Palestinian politics is completely fragmented. Not only that, but fragmented on political terms, but also fragmented regionally inside Palestine, as well as almost non-existent across the globe. So that's, in essence, the sixth point is very, very critical, because, again, a nation is not defeated unless its will to resist is completely snuffed out. And if the organization or the structure that was present, that represented the Palestinian global mobilizations with almost 110 different countries recognizing and engaging the the PLO, is very important. So this is where we are. The consequences of Oslo is very, very much real, and is present and looking us at the face. Knowing all of this, the question becomes, what should we do? What is it for us? Because you're telling us all that which is coming almost on a daily basis, and we realize. And again, I want to say that we're not the first people to have been occupied. We're not the first people to face settler colonialism. We're not also the first people to face the contradictions that arises from the settler colonialism. Division is part and parcel of colonial projects, settler colonial projects, and in general colonial projects. So part of it is divide and rule is embedded in it. It's also, we're not the first one to face a colonial project that actually almost undertake and completely takes hold of all the economic underpinnings of the society. Colonialism itself is previewed on an economic project itself, raw material, access to markets, access to labor, and so on. So we're not the only ones. So I don't want to exceptionalize our history, but rather to look at history in other places in order for us to draw lessons. And the first lesson that we need to come to terms with is that we have to find a way for us to articulate a collective vision for moving forward, both Palestinians inside Palestine and the majority of Palestinians that are in the diaspora. That is the fundamental step at this particular time that we need to undertake, meaning that some way of unification of our vision and our possibilities as Palestinians have to undertake, whether it takes the shape of a convention to be undertaken, a political convention with an agenda, whether various political parties can sit down in order to articulate a document that could put the framework for the Palestinians. Is very important, but this is urgently needed. We cannot continue to actually depend on a framework that got us into the position that we are in. The second, and I think is very important, we have to reconstitute the Palestinian National Council and to empower it in a real sense of we have 15 million Palestinians, maybe 12 to 15, maybe more. All of them are participants, should be participant in actually creating this body, and should be actually framed in exile, not under occupation, meaning that we cannot allow for a council to meet under conditions where Israel determines who is to be allowed and who is not to be allowed, to determine what what framing has to take place and what's not, to pre-read the documents that are put forth. We have to actually undertake that in a very systematic way. Third, I think what we need is to empower our own selves by creating and empowering a very robust units that can engage in researching, writing, responding in a very systematic way to the hegemonic structure that Israel has imposed on the Palestinians inside Palestine and outside Palestine. And I know there's been many efforts in the past, and I'm part of many efforts to try to engage in both a scholarly as well as activist level to respond. But I think it has to be a total Palestinian effort and created ways to respond in as many ways as possible. We have to reassess our history. We have to study what mistakes have been done in the past because, again, those who don't learn from history are apt to repeat it. And I think this is very important for us to actually undertake. We need to assess our own challenges and failures that we have undertaken. We need to assess the PLO project for the past 20 to 30, 40 years. What happened? What took place? All those are part and parcel. And this is not to critique who this person or this person. I think there's much to be critiqued, but in essence, to learn the lessons. We cannot reach to the level of ending the current dilemma that we find ourselves in without a clear assessment, without a clear understanding, in almost a scientific way, in order for us to reach a level where we are able to challenge. The fourth element, and I think this is very important, and I'll repeat it time and time again, is that the PDS movement is a very important, critical piece of the cluster of pieces that a Palestinian civil society inside Palestine and civil society outside have been successful in doing so. And I would like for the Palestinian Authority and the PLO itself to actually adopt the PDS movement in real, and also put that on the table of every other Arab Muslim as well as countries that is allied and continue to express support for the Palestinians. We have to take it and make it as a serious project in the same way that during the apartheid period, the ANC, the African National Congress, actually committed itself to the boycott movement of South Africa. Their representatives in New York used to work with us. I used to be part of the anti-apartheid movement, was part of the committee here in the US, and we used to communicate with the ANC specifically on what are the strategies, the approaches, and what will work and what doesn't work. And they used to actually provide us the resources and information relative to how to counter the South Africa apartheid system. I would say today the PLO and the PA are completely absent of this struggle, and therefore one cannot actually say we are suspending relations, but in all effective areas those relations are still there, and often actually almost neutralizing or pushing aside those who are seriously engaged in the PDS movement. So it is time to actually realize that the train that you are on, the Oslo train, has been derailed long time ago, and it's actually continuously going, dropping down a cliff, a steep cliff to nowhere. And I think the sooner we realize this, the better it is, and I think we have to take PDS movement very seriously. Fifth, and I know that the Palestinian, the PLO and the Palestinian Authority have said that they're going to join a variety of United Nations bodies, also to engage in a variety of international legal maneuvering in order to bring Israel to face the responsibility. And my question is, what are you waiting for? What are you waiting for? Israel chases the Palestinian, the PLO, the Palestinian activists all around the globe, and it's been doing so from day one. And my question is, what are you waiting for? What is it that is needed that could actually tell you that Israel is not going to stop its continued erasure of the Palestinians, being inside Palestine or across the globe? So I'm waiting for, it's not a matter of public relations statement. We're done with public relations statement, honestly. We're not interested in another press conference to speak about another press conference for a press release that addresses another press release and statements that have to be checked with the State Department or the Israeli Foreign Ministry before actually is issued. It is time to de-link whatever is taking place with the Palestinian Authority from the mechanisms to take Israel into account in everybody in every corner around the world. So if the wait for something is delaying, I can understand there's some logistical issues, but the time is now to move forward with any opportunity to put Palestine on the agenda of an international body, of an international legal system, of a United Nations agency, or a non-state actors bodies. The time is now, and we will actually have to match words with deeds. Meaning that the Palestinian Authority and the PLO, in order for them to come back into a sense of responsibility toward their own people, again, this is an issue that involves all of the Palestinians. It not involves only one person who possibly had some limited, what you call, village or qarya, and they're talking about it. This involves the 15 million Palestinians, and it's time for people to rise up to the occasion and take themselves seriously and not to wait and try to negotiate away. Israel and the United States and also some European countries and Arab countries are going to try to peddle their own interest with Israel by trying to press and get the Palestinians to abandon one piece or the other. If you are in solidarity with Palestinians, then the best way for you to be in solidarity is to actually aid in putting Palestine on the international agenda and to put Palestine in every body where a claim for justice can be made by those who are affected by it. So we need to challenge our allies and those who speak to be allies with Palestine to use that framing and not to accept the dilatory tactics and tactics that are actually intended to actually delay and bypass Palestine because of other regional interests or international interests. And I think that has to be part of it. And I think we need to speak with one language, both domestically and internationally, in order to bring an end to the current crisis and current calamity that we find Palestine. So again, I recommend for you to visit my website. There's an article about the PLO suspending relations. I encourage you to read it. I also recommend for you to read my earlier piece from 1994 critiquing Oslo Agreement. I would say that almost word for word, everything that I have written in 1994 have come to pass. And therefore, I would say the sound analysis are there. And also to come to be with us next week, where I'll focus on the Trump administration and what does Palestine in relations to the U.S. agenda and present, whether it's Jerusalem, cutting the foreign aid, threatening the suspension or removal of foreign aid from UNRWA. So what are the current framework for the United States and how to begin to really understand the regional framing for the Trump's era for Palestine. So I encourage you to be with us next week. And also I encourage you to actually pose your questions on Facebook and Twitter. I'll take the time also to answer those questions. But please, if you're a racist, Islamophobe, and one who just wants to push Israel agenda, there's no interest for me to answer such questions. But if you have a serious question that have meaning, depth, and you have read more than just the PR press release from Israeli sources, then I'll be more than happy to actually welcome such questions. I am not a problem solver for colonialism. I'm a challenger and a challenge colonialism, settler colonialism. So I answer those questions that have meaning, depth, and understanding rather than a public relations framing. So thank you for being with us today, and I look forward to seeing you again next Thursday at 1:15 for another segment of this series. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.